This is a production of Fathom Ministries, expanding minds and hearts to reach for the reality of heaven, with Pastor Nathan Reynolds.
Welcome back to this week's podcast and video presentation, where we're going to do an addendum to our ongoing lesson in the series on the book of Genesis. We started this series a few weeks ago, and so what we're doing is in our live Bible study, we're going through the first chapter and the partial second chapter of Genesis. And then along the way, we're addressing some of the issues that are topical with regards to this lesson. And we want to address some peripheral issues that are not so peripheral. They're kind of important. Genesis 1:1 states, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." It doesn't present an argument for God. It just simply states that God is and that God exists. And so it is a very interesting topic online if you get into the back and forth between atheist and theist in arguments trying to present the arguments for and against God. And so that's what this lesson is about today. I'm going to refer you to YouTube where you can look up for yourself a particular debate between John Lennox and Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is an atheist professor who's an evangelist for atheism and one of the brightest minds atheists have ever produced in their arguments for their belief that there is no God. And then one of our wonderful heroes of the Christian faith, who is a scientist and a professor also from Oxford University. At least that's where he used to be a professor. I think they call him Professor Emeritus now. Is John Lennox. And John Lennox is a Bible-believing Christian scientist, mathematician, and professor who is a brilliant scientist and a brilliant man of God. And he has written a lot of different books, but if you're interested in the full debate that I'm going to use some clips from in this lesson today, I would refer you to YouTube and just look for the title, "Has Science Buried God?" And you'll be able to find the full debate. It is not my intention to show you the full debate here because of the problem with time. So I want to highlight some clips and let you share them with me as we go through them together. And I want to show you what the smartest atheist in the world thinks about God and his arguments against God. And I think you're going to feel pretty good when you hear what he has to say and how simplistic many of his arguments are. And also when you hear John Lennox and his responses to some of these things. So let's open this up, first of all, with a clip from the beginning of this debate that happened a few years ago. And I will talk to you more about it on the other side.
Richard, the question as we begin is, has science buried God?
Well, which God? I mean, we could take Einstein's God, which is not really a personal God at all, but which is a sort of poetic metaphor for the mystery, that which we don't understand about the universe. We could take a deist God, a sort of God of the physicists, a God of somebody like Paul Davies, who devised the laws of physics, God the mathematician, God who put together the cosmos in the first place and then sat back and watched everything happen. And that would be, the deist God would be one that I think it would be, one could make a reasonably respectable case for that, not a case that I would accept, but I think it is a serious discussion that we could have. The third kind of God is one of which there are thousands and thousands of varieties, Zeus and Thor and Apollo and Amun-Ra and Yahweh. And we don't actually need to go through all those because as Larry has said, I've encountered John Lennox before and I know what the God he believes in, which is the Christian God. So we only have to talk about the Christian God. John Lennox is a scientist who believes that Jesus turned water into wine. A scientist who believes that Jesus somehow influenced all those molecules of H2O and introduced proteins and carbohydrates and tannins and alcohol and turned it into wine. He believes that Jesus walked on water. I had been accustomed to debating with sophisticated theologians, and I come across John Lennox, who is a scientist who believes in all those things. In particular, he believes that the creator of the universe, the God who devised the laws of physics, the laws of mathematics, the physical constants, who devised the parsecs of space, billions of light years of space, billions of years of time, that this paragon of physical science, this genius of mathematics, couldn't think of a better way to rid the world of sin than to come to this little speck of cosmic dust and have himself tortured and executed so that he could forgive himself. That is profoundly unscientific. Not only is it unscientific, it doesn't do justice to the grandeur of the universe. It's petty and small-minded, and that's the God that John Lennox believes in.
All right, so what you just heard there was this brilliant man, who's no doubt a very smart man, really try to sort of put forth the idea that Christianity is completely unimaginably stupid and ridiculous because someone would believe that the God of the universe would be able to do supernatural things like miracles. And so it's quite funny to see how he comes out of the chute, so to speak, looking to make his case, and of course trying to engender an emotional response that says, look at what this brilliant scientist that I'm going to debate believes before we even begin. And he's trying to discredit John Lennox by making him appear to be just unimaginably stupid. But, of course, they never stop to think that the God who created the entire universe, with the brilliance that it would have taken in order to do that, a universe, by the way, that's so large and so daunting that no one can grasp its massiveness nor its complexity. And yet we're supposed to believe that if something is believed to have happened out of the natural order and something that doesn't happen normally or on a regular basis, that is far-fetched and fantastic. But this believing that a universe created itself, that is not fantastic at all. As a matter of fact, there's no miracle to that, but real miracles are completely unimaginable. So I hope you caught that in his first attempt here in this clip. And I want to go to the next clip now. And what I want you to notice here is how Dawkins' whole premise is, let's not think about God or his existence because that's just too complicated. Watch this.
As a scientist, we both believe in the rational intelligibility of the universe. I believe the universe is rationally intelligible because there's a creator God behind it. Now, how do you account for the rational intelligibility of the universe?
Well, John, you said that I believe that the universe is a freak accident, which is the opposite of what you believe. For many years, for many centuries indeed, it seemed perfectly obvious that it couldn't possibly be a freak accident because you only had to look at living creatures, the sort of magnificent diversity we see in this museum, and everything looks designed. And so it was clearly preposterous to suggest that it was due to any kind of freak accident. Darwin came along and showed that it's not actually a freak accident, but nor is it designed. There's a third way, which in the case of biology is evolution by natural selection, which produces a close imitation of something that is designed. It's not designed. We know that now. We understand how it happened. But it looks very designed. Now, the cosmos hasn't yet had its Darwin. We don't yet know how the laws of physics came into existence, how the physical constants came into existence, and so we can still say, is it a freak accident or was it designed? The analogy with biology might discourage us from being too confident that it's designed, because we had our fingers burned before the 19th century in thinking that biology, which looks so much more obviously designed, that we got our fingers burned there. Now, in the case of the cosmos, freak accident or design, the point that I've made over and over again is that even if we don't understand how it came about, it's not helpful to postulate a creator, because the creator is the very kind of thing that needs an explanation. And although it's difficult enough to explain how a very simple origin of the universe came into being, how matter and energy, how one or two physical constants came into existence, although it's difficult enough to think how simplicity came into existence, it's a hell of a lot harder to think how something as complicated as a god comes into existence, difficult enough to think of how a deist God comes into existence, and even more difficult to think of how a Christian God who actually cares about things like sin and gets himself born of a virgin.
So to recap what we just heard, Dawkins makes the case that for most of history, everything that existed looked designed, and he even uses the word obviously was designed. And yet he is coming around to an argument that says, but now we're smart enough to know it wasn't designed, and as a matter of fact, it isn't helpful for us to consider the concept of a Christian God because it would be far too complicated. So we're going to go to our assumption that we have a universe that is obviously, I mean, everyone can tell by looking at it that it looks like it's designed, and yet it isn't actually designed by anyone. Is that what intelligent atheism takes their stand on today? Is this all they can come up with in order to erase and eradicate the concept and the possibility that a God created the universe and there's an eternal God mind behind the design of this universe? That is preposterous. They're saying until Darwin, it was obvious there was a designer, but then Darwin came up with the explanation. Man, you talk about just coming up with something that is merely feasible, which to me, though I'm not a scientist, their proposition from the theory of evolution is not even feasible. But to them and to, most of the scientists that exist in the world today, they look at this crazy idea, even though they have no clue how the universe started, and they have no clue how life began, and they have no clue how all the design happened that is in existence today. They think that it is a reasonable argument to say that it's more natural to believe that the world happened through something they call natural selection than it is to suppose that there is a God with a mind who designed it with a purpose behind everything. That doesn't work for me, ladies and gentlemen. That is intelligence that I can't even begin to understand as a default position that is reasonable. To me, what he is proposing here is not only unreasonable, it's much like the story of the emperor with his new clothing. It's like everyone's pretending that this makes sense when it doesn't make any sense. It's absolutely just sophistry. It's an argument that supposedly makes sense, although it doesn't make sense to me. But to the scientists, they listen to it and they nod in agreement. And they go, no, this makes sense. This is what makes sense. It makes more sense than that there's a God. And yet, when I hear it, it's like, no, the emperor does not have clothes. I'm not going to walk into that assumption here. Even Dawkins' own words here. It looks designed. It's obviously designed. In other words, when you look at how he's making his argument, he is couching it with words that do not make sense. When you say something is obviously designed and looks designed, and that you need someone to explain to you how it could not be designed in order to accept that premise, it is absolutely crazily ludicrous. And then he admits, although we don't know how the cosmos came into being and we don't know anything about the laws of physics and their origin, it is simply not helpful to postulate a creator. Wow, it's not helpful? To me, ladies and gentlemen, it helps a lot. If I took you into a grand ballroom where an architect had beautifully designed a building, and I said to you, nobody designed this building, you would think I was crazy, and you would be right to think such a thing. You would use the same words that Dawkins used and say, no, obviously it looks very clear to us that this building has a designer, and we want to know who designed it. It takes someone who is so bent on not finding God that they are willing to ignore, here's that word again, the obvious, so that they can look deep enough to find that explanation, that sophistry that would explain why there doesn't need to be a creator. That's why atheism is certainly a faith, and it's certainly a religion, because it is not based on anything sound, because they are denying the obvious, and they're denying what their eyes are telling them and what their heart is telling them. So it's very obvious by the words that they use that they don't even know how to make the argument without capitulating to the fact that it all looks like there's a God behind it. And the funniest part of this is how you get an insight to how he feels about the Christian God, because he says that the Christian God is the most difficult one to comprehend or to imagine, because it would be someone who cares about things like sin and gets himself born of a virgin. That was amazing. The language and the use of this sarcasm to attack the Christian God and to say you can't have a grandeur God who does miracles and who cares about things like sin. I wish someone would ask him, do you have kids? And do you care what they do? And is that based upon your love for their good, for the good in their future? Because if you have children, you do not send them out to party all night and tell them, hey, do whatever you want. Sin is not sin. It's no problem. Drink, drugs, sex, rock and roll, whatever you want to do, no limits. Go for it. Have fun. Nobody that loves their children would do that. Even people who don't even live by rules learn to get rules when they get kids that they love, because they realize that their kids will be destroyed soon and they will go through horrible loss if they don't teach their children to discriminate between good and evil, between good behavior and bad behavior. And so he can't conceptualize a God who would be interested in sin of his people that he created. And yet that's the reason he's walking away from the concept of a Christian God. This is highly ludicrous. Now let's go to video clip number 3, where we're going to see Dawkins double down on his argument that God is too complex, so we shouldn't consider him.
You say this illusion of design, and of course I find your writing so fascinating because of the metaphors and images you use. I do envy that capacity. And you said somewhere that it's terribly, terribly tempting to believe that it has been designed. But that Darwin has shown us that this design is an illusion. But I've been very interested in the kind of thing that Simon Conway Morris has been saying recently, that if you take the evolutionary pathways, they're navigating through an informational hyperspace with phenomenal precision. And therefore, there is the impression of design at that level. I mean, if this mechanism that you talk about, which doesn't account for the origin of life at all, but let's leave that aside, if it is so phenomenally clever, then it itself is giving evidence that there's a mind behind it.
The whole point of Darwinian natural selection is that it works without design, without foresight.
But that's an
guidance.
assumption.
No, it's not an assumption. That is exactly how it works. Before Darwin came along, it looked perfectly obvious that even if evolution happened, there must be some guiding force to tell animals or plants how they ought to evolve. Natural selection is a blind force. The things that survive, survive. With hindsight, we can see that the ones that survive are the ones that are good at surviving. They have the genes that make them survive. Simon Conway Morris would not deny that. He's got some kind of, well, actually, I rather share his view of convergent evolution. We both of us are perhaps on the extreme end of Darwinians in that we emphasize the power of natural selection to home in on particular ends. Particularly, if you look around the museum, you'll see animals, marsupial animals from Australia, that uncannily resemble non-marsupial animals, and Simon and I are both extremely keen on that. But that's produced by natural selection, as he would say. Natural selection is a mechanical, blind, automatic force. It's not, I can't say it's not guided, but there's no need for it to be guided. The whole point is that it works without guidance.
But it could be guided. Or do you completely shut that out?
I mean, why bother when you've got a perfectly good explanation that doesn't involve guidance?
I mean, the point is,
gratuitously
you use words like blind and automatic. This watch is blind and automatic, but it's been designed. The words themselves do not shut out that notion. And it seems to me that the impression I'm getting is that what's coming through is that the whole process is so sophisticated, it itself is giving evidence of a rational mind behind it. But am I understanding you right, that you say you deny that because you have an in-principle reason for denying it? That is, everything must, as far as you're concerned, go from the simple to the complex. And therefore, your major argument in the God delusion, if I understand it right, is that God is, by definition, more complex than the thing you're explaining, so he's got to be explained. Is that right?
That is a major point that I want to make.
First of all, I want you to notice that Lennox brings up that he believes that the design is an illusion. And Dawkins doesn't protest that. And so what we have here, ladies and gentlemen, and we have a creation that in Dawkins' view made and created itself through an intelligent explanation called natural selection. And this natural selection was so good at being able to figure out how to create life and to bring a world into existence that moved from simplicity to complexity, that it also created this illusion that the world was created. In other words, this blind mechanism called natural selection was so good that it wanted to leave behind an illusion to those who see it. So this blind mechanism creates vision in animals and people who can see what it has created, and done so by the accident of natural selection, and at the same time created an illusion of design. Wow! This is a really interesting thing. If you could make natural selection God and then just move mask around, you might even end up with God himself, because it's so brilliant. This is just amazing what this argument is saying. And if you remember, Lennox actually is making that case. He's saying that if it's that sharp and it can do these kind of things, this mechanism, and he's referring to natural selection when he says mechanism, this is what he's saying. He's saying that they're so blind, the atheists are so blind that they can't even see the brilliance of the God who was able to do all of this and create for them, remember, the illusion of design, when it's not an illusion at all. It's reality. And they're in the illusion that something that looks designed by all physical evidence is designed is not, and that it's merely an illusion. So then Dawkins says the whole point of Darwinism is that it all works without a designer and without a design. This is amazing, and this is revealing as to his honesty, whether he meant to be quite this open or not. He doesn't want there to be a God. And Darwin evidently didn't want there to be a God, or at least in his view, this is the motivation behind his view of Darwinism, and Darwinism itself is to prove that there need not be a designer. Because if there's a designer, there is a mind behind it. And if there's a mind behind it, you have a God behind it. You have a creator. And he's God because he is so brilliant and he's so able to do these things. But for them, they can't see that God, because the point is, Darwinism proves you don't need a God. And that's it. Case closed. And of course, Lennox jumps in and makes it very obvious. No, this is an assumption. And then we see Dawkins saying, absolutely not. This is the way it is. And he's emphatic about it. He thinks that he's proven his point. Dawkins declares, that's exactly how it works. Is it? Was he there? Does he know how it works? He thinks he does. And then Dawkins declares that natural selection is a blind force. That means that it doesn't have foresight and that it doesn't see into the future. It just creates life and things and mechanisms and creatures. It's creating all these things in a blind mode. And yet it's so brilliant. It will create an illusion or an illusory effect so as to throw off the eyes that it created that's going to see it, so that it looks like there's a brilliant designer when the real brilliance is there's no designer at all. What a brilliant, awesome thing. Doesn't make sense. If you walked out of your house, I use this analogy a lot, but if you walked out of your house and there was a tree in your yard that grew really big leaves, and one day you got up, walked to your front door, and someone had laid 5 large leaves side by side, evenly laid out, and then 5 more and 5 more, making a leaf sidewalk that led exactly to where your car was parked on the driveway and led to the driver's door where you get in every day. Is there anybody in the world that could explain to you with a straight face that the wind blew those leaves in a blind force and they just accidentally fell into place on the ground in that pattern? And this is the first time and the last time you'll ever see it, but look at that. What a coincidence. there isn't a scientist, atheist or not, in the world that would accept that as a premise that seems reasonable and logical. And yet that this universe, in the complex form that it is in now, as we observe it, could do what it has done with blind. Remember, the mechanism of natural selection is blind, so it has no foresight to prepare for the unforeseen because it's not seen, it's blind. This is, ladies and gentlemen, a completely bogus and preposterous argument that only an insane person would actually accept. It's just like I say all the time, it's the emperor's new clothes analogy, in spades. It's just fantastically inventive and sophistic, and it is the height of sophistry, which is trying to present another side to an argument that, though we know the side that is true, we want to play devil's advocate and create another side. And that's what these atheists are doing. They're creating another side to the argument that is plausible to themselves. And that plausibility means that that's the more likely scenario that they accept as fact. And then we heard Dawkins declare that this blind mechanism called natural selection works without guidance. And when you try to figure out how evolution evolves and how it knows to make the strong stronger and to destroy the weak so that only the strong survive, even in that theory itself, which is certainly a reality in the limits of the things that we can see that do evolve over time, that we see that the things that do evolve and do change according to the environment around it, you could not say is a blind mechanism. We all know about chameleons, the lizard that changes color according to what its environment is. So if you put it on a blue cup, it turns blue. If you put it on a brown stick or branch, it turns brown, the same exact color as the branch. You cannot say that that mechanism in that lizard is blind. It is using something to sense color. And of course, I haven't studied up on the chameleon to know what science says makes it have the ability to know what color its surroundings are. I would presume it must be maybe its eyes that are doing that, and it's looking at colors, and then it can change its skin to that color. This is not a blind mechanism. This is a very visual mechanism that works for the chameleon. So here's another example of what really doesn't make sense from a non-scientific point of view, mine. I know enough about science to have studied it in school, but I am no scientist. But I do understand that you cannot have a completely blind mechanism and then have it be able to read data and adjust for the next generation. Something has vision and foresight in order to improve into the next generation or to make changes for the genes that are going to come out in the next group of creatures to adjust to the environment that's being adjusted to. For me, it is certainly fantastic to watch a chameleon or to look at where creatures have changed their abilities to hunt for different kind of prey. For instance, the way that science shows that some birds will grow longer beaks because the prey that they are going to survive on require it. And so there's an adjustment made in the animal. And it seems like it's a blind thing because the animal is not consciously creating the longer beak in their own mind, but somehow in nature, God made them to be able to perceive it on some level in their bodies so that it would produce a different chemistry for the next generation. This goes to the brilliance of the creator, the agent that does it, and the one who had the foresight to create those kind of creatures that can make those kind of changes over time. And that is an evolution. But evolution, though it exists, does not explain the whole story and does not explain where all of the changes are made. There isn't any demonstrable evolution that shows, for instance, these kind of changes where something that is once one kind of creature changes into a completely other kind of creature, such as from a monkey to a man, or from a bird to a dog, or any cross creature elements that are not in their own category. And this is what is very important to understand, that science is certainly using their blind mechanism of their own blindness in order to explain in theory what they think happened with evolution and how it breached these gaps. And yet, in so doing, they have no absolute evidence to show that it indeed happened that way. And they're good with that. So at the end of this clip, we see that Dawkins goes back and relies on and admits to the fact that God is just too complex. The idea of God is just too complex. And so he wants to retreat to this explanation that's called the blind mechanism of natural selection. And yet Lennox makes a fantastic point about his watch. And he goes, well, my watch is certainly a blind mechanism, but it has a creator. And we're going to hear more about this subject in another clip here in a moment. But it's so interesting how these things are just accepted. The blind mechanism theory makes no sense, even set into the theory of evolution, as I just demonstrated. It doesn't make any sense to me that it could possibly be a blind mechanism that actually improves upon its evolutionary process. A mechanism that's blind would have no foresight, and therefore there would be no evolving. Things would just stay the way they are if they didn't have foresight. This makes no sense. Now let's go to clip number 4.
But let me go back to what you were saying before about guidance. When you drop a stone, it falls to the ground, and you as a scientist will explain that by gravity. You wouldn't dream of saying, oh, there must be a God pushing it down. That's exactly what you're in effect saying with respect to evolution. Because we understand evolution in just the same kind of level as actually rather better level than we understand gravity.
No, and this is a very important point, because I detected in many of your writings that you oppose God and science as explanations. When Newton discovered the law of gravity, he didn't say, marvelous, now I can know how it works, I don't need God. God is an explicator at the level of an agent, not a mechanism. So that we can study mechanisms in biology. The more sophisticated they are, the more that might well point towards an agent. You don't argue away the existence of an agent by showing that there is a mechanism.
So Dawkins here starts off by saying that he's trying to make a comparison between someone who drops a stone, and by the way, the agent that he's talking about is gravity. In other words, why does the stone fall from the hand of the one who drops it? And yet he doesn't even see that his analogy makes no sense, because there is someone who's dropping the stone. So his focus here is on gravity and gravitational pull. And he says, okay, so we don't need a God to explain, or we don't need to explain that the stone falls because there's a God pushing it down behind the stone. And somehow we're supposed to believe that therefore nullifies the need for God, because a stone which is let go by someone will fall to the ground. I hope you can see how weak this analogy is, because there did have to be someone to move the stone and to drop it. And so there was an agent who dropped the stone. It's very hard to come up with these analogies that they're trying to make, that things can, without foresight and with complete blindness and a mechanism in itself, that there would be a mechanism, a machine. Who created the machine? That's the question. Doesn't there have to be a start to a mechanism? How did the first mechanism come together, that blind mechanism come together? There's no explanation that will satisfy that question. I love how this clip ended with Lennox saying, you don't explain away the need for an agent by showing that there is a mechanism. As a matter of fact, once again, I think that a 6-year-old would know that if you show them a machine, that's what a mechanism is, a machine, that if you show someone a machine, that by the self-evidence of what you see in that it is a machine that works, that someone had to design the machine. In other words, there had to be an intelligent designer behind it to create that machine. Machines are not grown out of space. Nothing like a machine ever comes to pass that we've ever seen that did not have someone design it. And so this was a really crucial point that he made there on the end. All right, we're going to go to clip number 5.
And I don't quite understand how you managed to get, if I understand you right, God and science as alternative explanations.
Well, I think you do get rid of an agent if the agent is superfluous to the explanation. That when you're studying something that's happening, there may well be an agent, and it may, if you're watching a car driving along and avoiding obstacles and turning left and turning right, you say there is an agent controlling that car, and certainly there is. There's a driver. But if you don't need an agent to explain what's going on, and we don't in the case of biology, and we don't in the case of gravity. Of course, I accept that Newton was a theist. He lived in the 17th century and everybody was. But you don't need an agent. An agent is a superfluous explanation. It's a gratuitous grafting on of something that you don't need.
Well, I find that unconvincing, because even if you accept the whole evolutionary paradigm, it depends on there being a fine-tuned universe. And that fine-tuned universe raises in itself very big questions as to the origin of the universe. Evolution doesn't deal with that.
No, it doesn't.
Nor does it deal with the origin of life.
No, those are separate points.
Those are separate points, but they're vastly major points.
They are, yes.
In this clip, we're going to revisit something Lennox said when he was asking about why God has to be excluded from science. Dawkins suggests that science and God are incompatible with each other. And so if you believe in God, you're going to have to forego science. And of course, this is a ridiculous accusation, but it's caught on with a lot of people today, especially atheists. But I'm sure a lot of common people think that science has disproven God or the Bible to such a degree that they are no longer compatible. That if you believe in God, you've denied science. And that's the assumption here. And of course, this is far from the truth. Now, once again, notice that Dawkins' explanation against the idea of an agent assumes some things as normal. So he's acting like it's normal that there would be something complex that appears to be designed but does not have a designer, nor does it need or have an agent, and that this is somehow the normal presumption that we should go with. And what is so obvious to me is it's how he puts forth his argument. And he does so by saying, if you see something that's happening, then there may be an agent. No, it's not a matter of there may be an agent. What Dawkins says here is when you're studying something that's happening, there may well be an agent. You got to listen close for these details. There may well be an agent if something's happening. let me say this. He's assuming that it's likely in many cases that there wouldn't be an agent, but there could be an agent. That's the way he's trying to present his argument, that having an agent would be like a possibility, but not necessarily the common thing you would find. And yet in life, this is exactly the opposite of what we experience. When we see something that is obviously designed with some pattern, for instance, or a pattern of behavior, we don't assume there may be an agent. We know there's an agent. We know there's a designer. It's 9 out of 9 times that you find something with patterns that are happening, there's an agent behind it. And yet, he is using the argument as if, oh, we all know that there could be an agent, but it doesn't necessarily suggest that there is an agent, that there are some things, we're all familiar with those things that don't have agents, where there's design obviously there, but there's no agent behind it. This is another one of those things that's a head shaker. Okay, so finally, Dawkins is saying, if you don't need an agent, and then he asserts, and we don't in the case of biology and in the case of gravity. You can pick on the gravity as an example of something that doesn't need an agent to make it work. But the fact of the matter is, the one who designed the universe and made gravitational pull a very key factor in keeping the universe in order and safe and moving in the right direction, that one needed an agent. But as for gravity to work in the earth, for the rock that someone drops to land on the ground, no, we don't need to be connected to the agent. We don't need an active participation with the agent for gravity to work, because the agent, which is God, made gravity to work without his help or interference or assistance. He doesn't need to do anything to make gravity work. And likewise, many of the laws of physics and of nature are that way. God sustained them by putting them in place so that they would continue, just as the sun continues to shine, and of course it's on fire, and it continues to burn because God gave it enough fuel so that it wouldn't run out of fuel. And so God doesn't have to send tanker trucks with gasoline up to the sun and have angels pouring new gas on the sun every day so that the sun will continue to shine in our sky. No, he just made it with a supply of fuel that would sustain itself long enough for it to outlast its necessary life, so that the planet that we live on could sustain the life that we have and the creatures that are on it, so that it would serve them, and therefore God made it big enough and with enough capacity to do so. This is what the agent did, but the agent was so smart that he made it to where he didn't have to refill it every day, and he didn't have to renew it every day. He made it self-sustaining, and that's what they're looking at in science, watching the self-sustaining the self-sustaining parts of law and of physical things and of the universe, and they're attesting to that because it's self-sustaining, then having an agent is superfluous, and therefore you don't need it, so let's get rid of it. I love the way this clip ends, because Lennox makes sure to point out that this man's accepted theory of evolution does not explain the origin of the universe or the origin of life or the origin of the laws of physics. And Dawkins just nods and nods. Yes, you're right. It doesn't. And it's a major issue. And so here again, the most brilliant atheist that exists in the world today has once again been shown to know little about the subject of which he is proclaiming, with a almost, you talk about a blind mechanism. He's a blind mechanism of faith that has invested all of his faith in the fact that there's no God. And he's determined to keep that faith intact no matter what he sees and no matter what the obvious issues are that prove otherwise.
To me, the biblical explanation in the beginning was the word, the logos. That makes perfect sense. And it makes sense of the fact that we can do science itself.
But you haven't explained where the logos came from in the first
Well,
place.
of course not, because the logos didn't come from anywhere.
Well then, in what sense is it an explanation?
Because the notion that you say you have to ask who created the logos, that says that you're thinking of a created God. The whole point about the God revealed in the Bible is that he was not created. He is eternal. He is the eternal logos. And I ask myself, as an inference to the best explanation, which makes more sense? That there's an eternal logos and that the universe, its laws, the capacity for mathematical description and so on, that these things are derivative, including the human mind, from the logos. That makes very much more sense to me as a scientist than it's the other way round, when there is no explanation for the existence of the universe. Do you just believe the universe is a brute fact?
The universe is an easier brute fact to accept than a conscious creator.
Well, who made it?
It's you who insist on asking that question.
No, you asked me who made the creator. The universe created you, Richard. Who made it then?
A God is a complicated entity which requires a much more sophisticated and difficult explanation than a universe, which is, according to modern physics, a very simple entity. It's a very simple beginning. It's not a negligible beginning, but it's a very simple beginning. That has got to be easier to explain than something as complicated as a God.
This clip that Lennox raises the idea of the language of DNA and how that we know of no language anywhere that does not come from and is not developed by a mind. As a matter of fact, language is the expression of a mind. And later on, we're going to have a few more clips that get into this deeper. And he explains the connection between the logos, which the Bible talks about in John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word. That word in the Greek is the word logos. And it's talking about the eternal mind or logos of God. And it shows how that he, the Bible shows, and Lennox will show, how that he, God, is the logos behind everything that exists and everything that's created, and that's where the design comes from. And as a matter of fact, the fact that we were created in the image of God, and the fact that we understand and can conceive of the science behind all of the things that we study, in those things that we do understand, shows a connection between our logos or our mind and the mind that produced us. In other words, for instance, back in the 80s, when personal computers were starting to be developed for the masses, I remember looking at them at different places in stores. They used to be in department stores like Sears and different places. That they came out in the beginning kind of as with video games and some programs and software that was able to be used in business, like a word processor. But mostly they would try to sell them with really cool video games and things of that nature. But I remember that when I started seeing computers and started talking to computer salespeople and asking them how they worked and various things. I remember how easily I understood computers. And I know not everybody does, but my nature and my mind is very akin to the personal computer. Now, put me on an Apple computer and I'm lost. The logic and the reasoning behind how Apple does its thing is completely foreign to me, and I don't get it. I've bought Apple computers. I've tried to use them. My iPhone, I love my iPhone, but it is not laid out logically, and every time I have to tweak something on it, if I don't do something on a regular basis, I will forget, because the way that Apple sets up its operating system does not follow logical to me. But when you get to a personal computer, a Windows-based computer, I totally understand it, and I can even take programs that are that I'm not familiar with, and I can familiarize myself with them a lot of times without a manual, because they flow logically to me. That's not because I have an understanding or some connection to a computer, but it's because I have a mind that is similar to the minds that created the computer. So it is the people who conceptualized and created the computer that I am akin to, and because I have a similar way of thinking in my mind and the way it works to the people who created computers for the first time, I was on their wavelength when I started studying computers, and so therefore it wasn't hard for me to adapt the use of a computer. All of this is my illustration to say that the reason that we can study how the universe is, how it functions, and we can look at the evidence that's obvious and come to the proper conclusions, at least those in our, those human beings that are of, the brilliant minds of science, they're able to study how these things are working by their patterns and by the motions that the functions of what they do and the motions that they are in. When it comes to planets and stars and these kind of things, they study the things that they are able to observe. And it is an indicator that there is a mind that's related to our mind behind it. That's why we can understand it. And that is evidence for the Logos, the God behind it. Because in some small, very small way, he has invested some of his own mind, his own Logos in us, so that when we see what he's done, we can relate to that. Just like when I saw my first computer and I understood how it worked. In those days, they didn't have hard drives. They didn't even have floppy disk drives. At the beginning, they used tape recorders as the way to save your work on a computer, or the software, or the program of the computer. You would save it to a cassette tape. And when I had it explained to me, I understood what the cassette recorder was doing. And that's because there was a human being with a mind similar to mine, though much more brilliant, who designed the first computer. And so when I came along with my limited capacity for thinking and science, I still felt like I understood the computer even before I actually understood the computer. I hope that makes sense, because that's exactly what I believe is happening when scientists are able to truly figure out things that are going on in the universe with science or with created things, and able to explain it. I believe that's because God has invested a little bit of the Logos in all of us.
The notion of things in principle going from simple to complex, and they must go that way, that seems to me to be your belief, your faith.
Well, things must go from simple to complex.
Yes.
No. I mean, if things go from simple to complex, we need an explanation.
Yeah, we do
Natural
indeed.
selection is an explanation for that. It's the explanation in the case of biology.
Well, let's go back to the level of the origins of the universe and the origin of life. Now, life, as we both know, has got this digital database. It's got a language all of its own. Now, the only thing we know of capable of producing language is mind. And yet you reject that. By definition, as an atheist, you must reject that. There's no mind behind this language.
I do reject it. When you say the only thing we know that can produce language is mind, I mean, we know that what produces human language is mind. Of course we do, because that's human language. But DNA is not human language.
Yeah, but
DNA
it's very sophisticated.
It's very sophisticated, but it doesn't follow that it has to be generated by mind.
But we know of no other conceivable way of it being generated. You see, because it seems to me from the mathematical point of view, I think you said this somewhere in a different context, junk in, junk out. Here we have this phenomenally sophisticated information processor, which is the cell. Am I really to believe that that information processing capacity simply came about by the laws of nature and random processes without a mind?
Yes.
Well, I find that impossible to believe as a mathematician.
I know you do.
Okay, let's just go with the simple, because that's easier to do. I keep going back to this phrase that I repeat. I don't get it. I do not understand the logic behind Dawkins' thinking here. We're going to throw God out here because he's too complicated, and this is what he keeps coming back to. There can't be a God because he's complicated. I think on the face of it, if there is a God, of course he would be complicated, because he would be more complicated than any of the complexities of his creation. By definition, we're looking at what is created and how complex it is. And then we're saying, and if there's a God, then of course we would expect to find him to be much more complicated and harder to explain than the stuff that he's created. And so what you have here is you have a faith. You don't have an argument of logic and reason. What you have is you have a faith in the blind mechanism of natural selection, which has no foresight, but creatively displays an obvious illusion that things are designed. That's what we're to believe if we go with Richard Dawkins' argument and we move against the biblical argument for God. Now let's move on to clip number 8.
I'm getting the message that it's ridiculous for me to believe in a God who created the universe and me, because I have to ask who created God. All I'm doing is turning that question round and saying, the universe, you admit, created you because there's nothing else. Well, then who created it?
I understand you perfectly. I'm making that we both of us are faced with the problem of saying, how did things start?
Yes.
I'm saying it's a hell of a lot easier to start with something simple than to start with something complex. That's what complex means.
But I don't think so. If I pick up a book called The God Delusion, it's a pretty sophisticated book. It's got lots of words in it. But actually, as I look at page 1, I don't even need to go beyond page 1. I conclude that it comes from something more complex than that book itself, namely you.
Yes. I mean, obviously, complex things exist and brains exist.
Well, why can I not look at the universe, the whole show, which includes Dawkins and Lennox?
I'll tell you why. Because my brain that produced a book has an explanation in its own right. That explanation is evolution. We go back and back and back to the origin of the universe. That provides an explanation for complex brains, and complex brains produce books and museums and cars and computers. Of course we have complex things that produce other complex things. But science has an explanation for where complex brains come from in terms of simple beginnings.
I don't think it has at all. At the level of the origin of life, reading the literature, even the recent literature, the word miracle comes up probably far too often for your liking anyway.
Now in this clip, we see that Lennox is creatively turning the argument on Dawkins that he uses to explain away God. He tried to get him to answer this question, which he could not answer, and that is, who created the universe that created Dawkins? And of course, it goes back to the same substantive answer, that the only answer to this could be someone who designed it, not someone who is a blind mechanism and is not a creator. So in this clip, we saw that Dawkins just goes back and back and back to explain how his brain, a complex brain, started off in simplicity because the universe was created from the simple to the complex. And so he had to go back and back and back all the way to the beginning. I love how fast we got to the beginning there, in order to describe and explain that you can't start with the complex, you have to start with the simple. And of course, it made no sense to Lennox, and it makes no sense to me. In this clip, Lennox does a great job of explaining what we would expect to find if there is a God in the universe and how it would work out. Listen to what he has to say.
Your assumption, as I understand it, is that there's going to be an exhaustive, reductionist, naturalistic explanation of everything in scientific terms. I don't think so. Now, if there is a God, and if he created this universe, and if, as I believe, he is personal, then I would expect certain things to follow. One, that I would see evidence, not proof, but evidence in the universe that God existed. I feel I see that in the mathematical describability of the universe, in the fine-tuning of the universe, and so on, and in the marvelous sophistication of the world. I'd expect to see God's traces there. I would also expect that there may be occasions when God speaks in special ways, and therefore the more we try to analyze those things in terms of purely reductionist science, it'll get more and more difficult instead of more and more simple. I wouldn't expect there to be many of those places. I think the origin of life might be one of them. And certainly when it comes up into more recent history, you mentioned miracles. The thing that is central for me is the fact that what you call petty, and I feel is vastly significant, because it's touching on something that affects every human being, the question of death. Now, if Jesus really literally rose from the dead as a matter of history, that makes an enormous difference to our view of the world. And so far from being petty, if this is God speaking to us, then I want to take it extremely seriously.
Now here, Lennox is bringing up a couple of things that are crucial to understanding if there is a personal God that he would have done. We would expect that he would do several things. One is reveal himself. That's self-revelation is a reference to the Bible. And it's a reference to even more along with that, how God revealed himself originally was not through a Bible, but was through people. God revealed himself to Adam, for instance, and Eve, right at the creation of everything. He talks about that you would expect that if there's a personal God, he would reveal himself. And of course, later in another clip, he makes it very clear by using Dawkins as an example of how we could not get to know a person like Dawkins unless Dawkins revealed his own self and how he really was to others. And of course, he also is mentioning how that God would address death, and that would be, since death is something that happens to everybody, that we would expect that he would give an explanation and a solution to death. And so that if you come into a study of the universe, without looking at the Scripture, or without maybe knowing about Scripture, that you would expect that you would find that God had revealed himself and that he would have addressed one of the most significant issues facing humanity, and that's the issue of death. And I think he makes a really brilliant point here to lay the foundation for this particular angle that is another proof of God's existence. Now, in keeping with our previous clip number 9, Lennox does a brilliant job of presenting Jesus Christ and the resurrection as the most significant thing that God has done personally for the human race, in both the revelation of himself and in the addressing the issue of death. Listen to what he has to say here. It's fantastic.
You mentioned miracles. The thing that is central for me is the fact that what you call petty, and I feel is vastly significant, because it's touching on something that affects every human being, the question of death. Now, if Jesus really literally rose from the dead as a matter of history, that makes an enormous difference to our view of the world. And so, far from being petty, if this is God speaking to us, then I want to take it extremely seriously.
Before I play this clip, I want you to watch for Dawkins' admission that if Jesus Christ came and was resurrected from the dead, that would make all the difference in the world. Note that, and then ask yourself, if you believe that Jesus Christ came into the world and died for your sins and was resurrected from the dead, and by Dawkins, the world's leading atheist evangelist, tells you himself that if this is true, this is the difference maker. Think about that. If it's true, it's the difference maker. And I will admit on my side, if it's not true, it is also the difference maker. And it means we are hopelessly in trouble. And all of this doesn't matter a hill of beans. We might as well just get out of life everything we can, because it's going nowhere. And I admit that. And so the crucial crux of the matter is, did Jesus come? Did he die? And was he resurrected by God, never to die again? If he did, then I can too. If he did not, then I cannot either. And so this is the crux of the matter.
Why do you think it's so petty?
Well, of course it makes a huge difference if it's true.
Yes, exactly.
But you've suddenly leapt from sophisticated discussions of the origin of the universe, where one can have a proper discussion about whether some sort of cosmic intelligence could have set forth the laws of physics. And you suddenly jump to a man who lived 2,000 years ago, was born of a virgin, rose again from the dead.
Well, I only did that because you mentioned it first at the beginning.
I think that's petty. By comparison with the grandeur of the universe. I mean, to put my point again, do you really think that the creator of this magnificent edifice of the universe, the expanding universe, the galaxies, he really couldn't think of a better way to get rid of the sins on this one little speck of dust than to have himself tortured? He's the one who's doing the forgiving after all. Couldn't he just have forgiven?
Because this is a moral universe, Richard, and just forgiving doesn't make sense.
I mean, he has to kill himself in order
to... He doesn't kill himself.
Or get himself killed, tortured.
God sends his Son into the world to provide forgiveness and to provide a basis on which he can justly bring forgiveness to me. Now,
he has to get himself killed in order to do that.
Half a minute. We need to step back from this a little bit, because it's actually a highly relevant topic. In your world, where is justice to be found?
Well, justice is a human construct of great importance in human affairs, and it's something that most of us have a sense of, which I think probably can be given some sort of Darwinian explanation, but I don't see where you're taking this.
Well, my question is there any ultimate justice? You see, you say this is petty. I'm saying I find myself in a world which is a broken world. I find myself in a world where there's massive injustice, where many people won't get it. We're so privileged. We live in Oxford and so on. We've got enough money to live on, etc., etc. But if there is no God, then there's no ultimate justice. And one of the things that the resurrection transforms for me from pettiness right into center stage is, if this is true, then there's real hope that there be a rational evaluation and fair justice at the end of the world. But atheism doesn't give you that.
Okay, suppose there is no hope, suppose there is no justice, suppose there is nothing but misery and darkness and bleakness, suppose there is nothing that we would wish for, nothing that we would hope for. Too bad. That doesn't make it true, just because God would make us feel good.
I hope in viewing this clip, you noticed that this all came down to a crucial part of the gospel of God, which I am also in a series on, producing podcast and video about this issue, because there's nothing more crucial than the gospel of God. And there's nothing under attack more than the reason that Jesus Christ came and died for our sins. And Lennox answers this perfectly, as you've seen here, where he brings in the issue of ultimate justice. And it is the ultimate justice that Dawkins does not get. And therefore, that's why he dismisses as petty that the majestic creator of the universe would waste his time coming into the world because he couldn't think of a better way to solve the problem of forgiveness of sins. And he, the atheist, says, why couldn't he just forgive? And this is crucial because there's Christians today which are selling the gospel in the same light as the atheist and saying, Jesus Christ did not die for your sins, and he did not become the sacrifice and the one who paid the price for our sins and received the judgment of God. And it is actually in that understanding that he did indeed receive the punishment of sins, and that in his flesh he did pay the penalty for that sins. That's why we call it the penal substitution. This is the crucial matter of the gospel of God. And so don't listen to people who are minimizing the gospel of God, and realize that those who are on the side of Dawkins. They're not on the side of the Christian. It is truly not too many steps away from that destruction of the gospel of God that you will get to atheism, because pretty soon Jesus Christ coming into the world is just as bewildering to the so-called Christians who are abandoning the true gospel of God, and they're running in the direction of the atheist, thinking that, oh, God just forgives sin if he wants to, and that's as simple as it is. This is not the case, and I'm glad you were able to hear Lennox's version of this. So this ends with a declaration from Dawkins that it's just too bad if there's no ultimate justice. And it would be absolutely awful if there was no ultimate justice, because it takes away hope. Hope that there is somebody who cares about justice, somebody who cares about the wrongs committed against the innocent, somebody who is watching over the scales of justice and will bring people to answer for their part in destroying other people and in humiliating and hurting other people, killing other people. I believe that God made this universe very obvious that the missing item in the universe is that ultimate justice. When you think of a Hitler, and you think of the millions of people that he destroyed, like the 6 million Jews and others, I'm sure many others in many different categories that he destroyed of his own people and of those that he didn't like. There is no way that he got justice. As a matter of fact, history tells us that he committed suicide in order to avoid facing justice of a humankind. And that seems so unfair that someone could get away with doing what they did and then to go into their own self-destructive mode and finishing themselves off. And of course, from the atheist point of view, that person no longer exists, and therefore is the only punishment that they suffered was at their own hands. And yet, what the Bible teaches about God is that that person is going to be resurrected to face God, and that every single thing that they did against the laws of God and against people they are going to be held responsible, and they are going to be punished accordingly with the due punishment that comes from a honest and sincere God of truth, who sees to it that those who sin pay the full price for their sins. This is hope for the innocent. This is hope for those who have been completely mowed down by the actions of other people. And of course, what we see at the end of that clip is Dawkins saying, too bad. It just isn't going to work out that way. And in his world, he doesn't think it is, yet he himself is going to face that God one day, and he's going to give an account himself of the damage that he's doing in proclaiming to the world of created beings that there's no God. Now let's go into clip number 11. This clip begins with Dawkins asking Lennox why he brought up the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Notice in this clip, right before I play it, that there's a discussion back and forth about there is no hope without God, in which Lennox accuses Dawkins of having admitted, and yet Dawkins says he hasn't admitted it. Well, what's missing here, I think, is that what Lennox is saying to Dawkins is that he just said there was no hope of justice, that there was no ultimate hope of justice, which Dawkins did previously admit in the clip I played you earlier. And so he did admit there's no hope. I think he just took it wrong whenever Lennox said that back to him. But I just want to remind you that he did say it's too bad if there's no justice. And that was the hope, basically, that Lennox was talking about.
Well, then why do you bring that argument up?
Because I believe that there is evidence that it is true. I don't believe in the resurrection just like that. Because faith is based on evidence.
I've changed your ground again. What you said before was that there is no hope without God, and it sounded
well, that's true. That's absolutely true. Okay. You just admitted it.
So I haven't admitted it. I said if that's true.
Yes.
So what? I didn't say it was true.
Once again, before I play this clip, I want to have you watch for what Lennox is doing here. He is once again bringing in Jesus Christ, God incarnate, as one revealing himself to us. And he's pressing that issue again. And it's really ingenious the way that Lennox was able to weave the gospel into this debate, because he made central parts of his arguments based upon the coming of Jesus Christ into the world as God incarnate, and that he was raised from the dead, therefore giving man hope beyond the grave, hope of overcoming death and showing that there could be a resurrection of death. And as you'll see in a few moments, he actually gets into believing in life after death. And it's so neat how brilliant this Christian's professor of science was able to weave in this crucial part of the gospel into this presentation and debate.
But anyway,
But therefore the question to be decided then is there a God, and has he revealed himself? And that's where again I think this pettiness needs to be pushed aside, because I can't get to know you as a person. You're not just a scientific object. I could look at you through a telescope or a magnifying glass. I could even dissect you and so on and so forth. But because you are a person, I cannot get to know you unless you're prepared to reveal yourself to me. So the fact that the claim of Christ to be the truth, to be God incarnate, that makes perfect sense to me, because if there is a God who invented this wonderful, marvelous universe with all its science and all the rest, then he has taken the initiative in getting to know us and revealing himself to us. And he's revealed himself to us at the level we can understand. We're persons, he's a person. That at least makes sense. So one of the very important questions to ask is that really true? Or is this simply myth and fantasy?
Well, myth and fantasy for me.
Yeah, well, do you know, that disturbs me for the following reason. Reading your book, The God Delusion, you say that it's under scholarly dispute among historians that Jesus actually existed. Now, I checked with the ancient historians. That is not so. And it disturbed me. History is not natural science. But what I don't understand is this, why you would write something like that.
I don't think it's a very important question whether Jesus existed. There are some historians, most historians think he did. Some
They certainly do. I couldn't find an ancient historian that didn't.
Well, there are one or two, but I don't really care, actually, because precisely because it's petty. I mean, if you could possibly persuade me that there was some kind of creative force in the universe, there was some kind of physical, mathematical genius who created everything, the expanding universe, devised quantum theory, relativity, and all that. You could possibly persuade me of that. But that is radically and fundamentally incompatible with the sort of God who cares about sin, the sort of God who cares about what you do with your genitals, the sort of God who is interested, who has the slightest interest in your private thoughts and wickednesses and things like that. Surely you can see that a God who's grand enough to make the universe is not going to give a tuppenny cuss about what you're thinking about and your sins and things like that.
So you think that morality is not important?
Of course I don't think morality is not important. I'm a human being.
Sounds like you're saying it isn't important.
I'm a human being, and I live in a society of human beings, and within a society of human beings, morality is of course important. But we are one of billions of planets on a huge scale, and a cosmic God who bothers about this kind of human scale is not the kind of God that is compatible with a scientific view of the universe. It's a medieval view.
But do you think that size is the measure of importance? Incidentally, on a logarithmic scale, you're about halfway between the atom and the universe. So if God thinks in terms of logarithms, your point falls, I think.
I mean, this is in a sense an emotional argument we've come into now. And
I don't think so at all.
If I were going to respect a God, it would be the kind of God the sort of God that Carl Sagan might have worshipped, not the sort of medieval God who fusses about sin, the obsession with sin and righteousness and sort of. I keep coming back to this word petty, and I stand by it.
So Dawkins was totally backed into a corner over this historicity of the fact that Jesus Christ was a real person. And he tried to squeeze out of it by saying that there was one or two historians who didn't believe that he existed. But as you'll see, in another clip, he admits that Jesus Christ exists, and therefore it belies his intent to come across as if Jesus doesn't exist when he knows and has admitted to the fact that he does exist. That shows you that he is pushing an agenda that is not one that's honest. Not even in his own heart is it an honest agenda. It is a sleight of hand that he continues to propagate this idea that Jesus didn't exist, and yet he knows and admits that he does exist. What a obvious sign of someone who is pushing an agenda not based upon even what they personally know, but an agenda that is bigger than them, that's more important to them than truth. And that's what comes out in this debate. I find that that was one of the most revealing points of the debate, where you can see Dawkins just constantly backtracking and moving away from the idea of God because he can't stand the idea of a righteous God, a God interested in the minutia of human beings, a God that's personal, a God that relates to what men and women go through. Imagine the God that Dawkins would respect. It would be a God who could care less about what people do and about the quality of their life. And for sure, he wouldn't care about whether or not they got justice. We would just be a bunch of ants on the face of the earth. If someone stepped on us, oh well, too bad, in the words of Dawkins. But he has no interest in a personal God, a loving God, a God with empathy and compassion for the details of your life. I find that it is exactly the opposite that inspires me, that God cares so much in my life that he cares about my sins and my efforts not to sin. He cares about the charity and the love that I display, and he cares that I don't display hate and indifference and maliciousness toward my fellow man. God cares about the very thoughts of my heart, and he sends forth his word into my heart in order to change me from the creature I am of sin to a creature that is submitted to God and is dedicated to doing God's will and to following God's word. This is a personal God that hasn't lost me in the vastness of the cosmos, but knows exactly where I am at all times and cares about all the inner thoughts and fears that I have and about my future and about how I'm going to get from this life of death to a life that has eternal consequences and pleasures of salvation. That is what God that Dawkins has just rejected in that clip. Now let's move to clip number 12. In this clip, you're going to have to notice the complete hopelessness that Dawkins has adopted as his outlook on life, and how he looks at this hopeless future, this nihilistic existence that he believes in, with a sort of proud, I can take the facts as they are, the hard facts of life, and I don't have to look at life like a child. I can take it like a man and realize it's not going to be all that I hope it would be, but it's just whatever the facts are, that's the way I'm going to take it. If that's the way it was, well, I would say that's the way that would be the most noble way to take it. So I don't fault him for this approach. The only fault I'm finding here is how he thinks this is superior to what the person who believes in God and has a relationship with Jesus Christ and his outlook is. And so he's comparing the outlooks. This is the part that's laughable to me. If there were just as much of a chance of Dawkins being right and having the truth on his side as those on our side who believe in God, then I would say that this take isn't bad. It's the only, I guess, adult way to take the universe. But I'm so happy to know that this is not necessary, because this is not the take on life that is in accord with truth.
I think there's something wonderful about standing up and facing up to a universe where we are increasing our understanding, and we throw away childhood obsessions, we throw away the sort of imaginary friend that comforts us when we're children, and we feel the need for some kind of parent figure to turn to. I think when we grow up, we need to cast that aside and stand up tall in the universe. And it's cold, and we're not going to last for it. We're going to die, and we face up to that. And I think that's a nobler way of getting through life than to pin your hopes on childhood illusions.
So we're back to the question, inevitably.
We need the evidence.
We need the evidence. And what I'm suggesting to you is that we do have evidence. We have it in science, part of God's revelation. And it seems to me that by truncating everything and putting it into the science basket, so to speak, that I get the impression that you're not taking history really seriously. Otherwise, you'd interact with it. And I'm trying to get to the basis of why that is so. Because you regard what Jesus has done and who he is as petty. And I find the contrast between standing tall in a silent and cold universe with no hope, believing that your moral sense must ultimately be illusion. You're crying for justice because most people will never get it, because death ends everything. The contrast between that and enjoying the friendship, the personal friendship of God, and knowing that ultimate justice will be done, is immense.
Well,
but the
course
basic
it is.
question is it true or not?
Yeah, and that is the basic question. It is completely irrelevant if it's comforting, if it gives you hope, if it gives you happiness. That has nothing to do with whether it's true.
That I agree with entirely.
So we need to know whether it's true.
Yes.
Now, when you look at history, and let's leave aside, maybe I alluded to the possibility that some historians think Jesus never existed. I take that back. Jesus existed. However, if you're going to say that Jesus was born of a virgin, that Jesus walked on water, that he turned water into wine, that is palpably anti-scientific. There is no evidence for that. And if there were, you would be, well, I mean, no, there simply isn't any evidence for that, and no scientist could possibly take the idea seriously.
I can make it worse for you.
I know you can.
Because Jesus actually claimed to be the Logos that created the whole universe. And if this is the Creator incarnate, making water into wine and so on is really a triviality. The more fundamental thing is the fact that he claimed to be and gave evidence that he was God. When you say it's anti-scientific, I don't think it's anti-scientific at all. Science cannot say that miracles do not occur. It can say they're highly improbable. But nobody is claiming that these things occurred by natural processes. They occurred because God fed his power in. Nor did the whole universe, if we look at it, occur in that sense by natural processes. God created it. We study all the natural processes within it. So when you say it's anti-scientific, I think it's not anti-scientific.
What I mean by that is that if, and when doing science, we constantly have to keep in mind that at any moment there might be a little magic trick slipped in. That would completely nullify the whole enterprise of science.
Oh, I agree with that. But
well,
you see,
that's what you're allowing then.
No, I'm not allowing that at all. Because in order to recognize what the New Testament calls miracle, a special act of God, you must be living in a universe that has regularities and that we recognize them. I agree with you entirely.
Otherwise, you
That's
wouldn't
why-
notice the miracles. But,
That's exactly true.
Yeah.
You wouldn't recognize if dead people were popping up all over the place. You wouldn't think it was very special. But the fact is, you need two things, not one. You've got to have regularities which we call the laws of nature, although they're not causes. They're, in a sense, descriptions that we can use. You also need to be able to recognize those so that, for example, when Joseph discovered that his wife-to-be Mary was pregnant, he simply didn't believe her story. He was going to divorce her. He knew exactly where babies came from. He knew the regularity. It took very special convincing for him to realize that something extremely special had happened. But science cannot stop that. The question is, of course, did such a thing ever happen? And the central focus in the New Testament is not that, which is not so readily accessible to evidence, the virgin conception, but the resurrection of Christ. And ancient historians, and this has fascinated me recently going over it, ancient historians whose discipline is very venerable, and I'm not talking about Christian ancient historians, ancient historians, many of them, even at the skeptical end of the spectrum, say that the evidence for the resurrection of Christ is very powerful. The explosion of the Christian church from a non-proselytizing group of Jews in the first century, the empty tomb and all the rest of it, has even led Geza Vermesh, who's one of the most distinguished ancient historians in Oxford, to say, yes, this tomb was empty, and hallucinations and this kind of explanation do not wash. So we have to ask ourselves, are we prepared to believe in historical testimony or not?
Well, you must talk to different historians than the ones I talk to. But in any case, I still come back to the point that you cannot do science if at any time you remember that famous cartoon of the...
Oh, I do. And therefore a miracle happens
and the
in the middle
miracle
of the
happens.
equation, yes.
I mean, that is deeply against the spirit of science, and I don't think I could do science if I thought that at any time something like the resurrection, something like the virgin birth was going to be smuggled in by a godly caprice.
So the way this particular clip ends is just incredible. I thought that Lennox made such a wonderful case to present the resurrection as the central issue to begin with and to end with. And he really was able to completely befuddle his opponent there because he goes back to his claim that Jesus Christ did not exist in history. And you probably noticed that there was a Freudian slip there with Dawkins, because he said the historian I talked to, the one I talked to, and then he says those that I talked to, and he made it plural. I thought was pretty interesting, because it looks like to me, after everything he said about this, also the fact that he claimed in his book that there was doubt whether or not there was a man historically that was Jesus Christ, shows that it seems like that he found one person who may have been a historian who saw it like he wanted him to see it. And so I thought that was really revealing. And then the other thing that was revealing is that the very important question posed by Lennox on the end, where he said, the question is, are we going to pay attention to history and what the historians have said? You'll notice that there was no answer to that question. In this clip, we heard Dawkins admit that Jesus Christ existed, which shows that he believes that it is true. And yet he would not want to be caught saying, I am going to say, no, I'm not going to pay attention to the historians, the ones that all conclude that Jesus Christ did exist. So he obviously didn't want to do anything with the data that is the result of saying, yes, I believe Jesus existed. Now, what am I going to do with it? he's not going to do anything with it because he must reject the supernatural. And that's why in the end there, he goes back to the virgin birth and making water into wine and all of those things. So once again, his beliefs are beliefs and their faith in the religion of atheism. And it's quite clear that it has nothing to do with the science. It has to do with the hoped for fact that there would be no God. That's what he's hoping in. Clip number 13 we're going to see next is Dawkins trying to explain the laws of physics and why it doesn't need a designer. And this will be the final clip, and then we have two clips. I guess it's not the final clip, but it's next to the last two, which are the closing arguments, which I probably won't have that much to comment about, but I want to include them so that you can see how the debate ended. And please notice that Dawkins is going to bring up the multi-universe theory, which is a theory that is helping to satisfy the mathematics behind the probability that our universe could actually do this blind natural selection process with no designer. Because what's happening is we can calculate the possibility or probability of these things happening, and the numbers are so astounding that they have to create the myth of a multi-universe, which we have no evidence of whatsoever, that there are multiple universes in the same numbers that there are stars and that there are galaxies. So they want to create the idea that we're just one universe amongst millions or billions of other universes, and therefore you can take the math out and make it more probable that life could exist without a creator, without a designer, by just chance. And so this is the most laughable of the latest of science ideas in order to explain the origin of the universe by creating this. And this is just laughable to me, how we can postulate multiple universes when there is no evidence that there's anything except one.
To Professor Dawkins, how do you explain the origin of the laws of physics?
I do not know the origin of the laws of physics, as I've said again and again. What I do know is that whatever they are, and I've said this again and again, whatever they are, it certainly doesn't help to propose that they were designed by a conscious intelligence, because that simply makes a bigger question than you've solved. Now, the laws of physics, to break that down a little more, it has been suggested that the laws of physics are extremely fine-tuned, and that if they were any different, the universe as we know it wouldn't exist, stars wouldn't exist, chemistry wouldn't exist, biology wouldn't exist, and we wouldn't exist. And theists are tempted to say, therefore, the laws of physics must have been designed in such a way that they are exactly fine-tuned to bring us into existence. Once again, that is a non-explanation, because it leaves open the explanation for the designer. There are many physicists who explain that by saying, well, with the so-called anthropic principle, saying that we could only exist in a universe which has the right laws and the right constants to bring us into existence, and therefore the fact that we're talking about it determines that we must be in such a universe. That's the anthropic principle. There are versions of it which make it a bit more plausible. For example, the multiverse theory, that there are lots of different universes, that we live in a kind of bubbling foam of universes, and each bubble in the foam has a different set of laws of physics. The vast majority of those laws of physics are not conducive to giving rise to us. A tiny minority are conducive to giving rise to advanced life forms. And once again, the anthropic principle comes in. We could only exist, we could only be in one of those bubbles that has the necessary laws of physics to bring us into existence. And therefore, obviously, since we do exist, since we're talking about it, we must be in such a universe. I haven't answered the question, but what I hope I have done is to show that whatever else the answer is, it cannot be God.
So, are you convinced that Dawkins has just made the absolute point that the explanation cannot be God? That didn't work for me. I don't follow that logic. I don't see how that could possibly be an explanation that is convincing to anybody except those who don't want to believe in God. And by the way, if you don't want to believe in God, I don't want to convince you that there's a God. That's totally fine with me if you don't want to believe in God. But it's not going to be fine with you when you do get to meet God, and that's the only problem. I believe that God has made everybody to have a will that he's going to respect. And if you hate God or you don't believe he exists, then I know that God will let you continue down that path if that's what you want. But I hope and I pray that that's not the case, that you'll listen to reason and that you'll realize there is no reasonableness to this logic of a blind creation that has so much ingenuity that it can create the obvious illusion of a designer without having a designer. This is just amazing that people with any intelligence at all would believe this. Now we go to the final two clips. And these two final clips are going to be the closing arguments made by both gentlemen. And I want you to hear those two closing arguments. And then that will be the end of this presentation. I do want to say before I close and play their final arguments that if I do encourage you to look on YouTube and search for this full debate, watch it in its entirety. I did cut it up to make it small, minuscule sound bites in order to make the points I wanted to make. And I did not intentionally hide anything in this debate for any nefarious reason. And therefore, I want to make sure you understand that I want you to hear the whole debate, and I encourage you to do so. But I wanted you to hear the salient points from both sides that I thought that they would consider salient that were made. And I thought our side, on the Christian belief faith side, that Lennox did a fantastic job of keeping the gospel in the core of this debate, not just speaking of God in a generic way, but personalizing that God with our Lord Jesus Christ, who did personalize God for us and make him someone that we know existed as we do, and someone who showed himself to be more than just a man and who was Almighty God in the flesh. So thank you for taking the time to hear my presentation of these clips, and I encourage you to look for further podcasts and or videos in a few days where we are going to continue our series on Genesis and talk more about Lennox's book that we're studying and taking notes from as we look at the first and second chapter of the book of Genesis and the arguments that are made from both the Bible and from science for the authenticity and the veracity of Scripture, and specifically the book of Genesis. Thank you, and God bless you.
Okay, gentlemen, now what I would like to do, I want to give you ample time for your closing remarks. And so we will begin with Professor Lennox. You may take 5 minutes, no more than 5 minutes, and then we will conclude with Professor Dawkins. He will have the last word.
Has science buried God? I think not. Science arose in the 16th and 17th centuries, a meteoric rise that historians of science have looked at and come to the conclusion that one of the main motors driving the rise of science was faith in God. So far from belief in God being a science stopper, it was the thing that caused science to rise in the first place, understandably so, because people had a basis for believing that the universe was rationally accessible, and so they could do their science, which is apparently one of the reasons given by Needham, the famous sinologist in Oxford, when he looked at China and asked the question, why did science not develop in this way in China? And in the end, although he's a Marxist, he came to the conclusion that it was because of the Christian background. So I'm not ashamed of being both a scientist and a Christian. And I suppose that the major argument that points, doesn't prove, but points towards God is that this universe is a universe in which science can be done. The fact that the laws are there. Richard honestly says he doesn't know where they come from. They come from the Logos, the mind that is behind this universe, that has created it by his power and for his glory. And therefore doing science, like Galileo and Kepler suggested, doing mathematics, is to discover the secrets of the universe in the language in which God has written them. The other reason why I reject atheism as an explanation is it doesn't even, to my mind, begin to rise to account for the rationality which lies behind science. Also, I think that the Christian faith, which I unashamedly espouse, is not anti-scientific. And I would plead for the same attention to be paid to history as is paid to science itself. I find very unconvincing arguments that trip very lightly over things that historians do accept, which mean that we should take the scholarship that has to do with the existence and the resurrection of Christ very seriously indeed. The other big area, which we didn't discuss in great detail tonight, is that if science has buried God, it seems to me there's something else that lies before us, and that is, where are we going to get our morality from? Because Richard has written in one of his books that the universe is just like we'd expect to find it. If at bottom there's no good, there's no evil, there's no justice. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. That seems to me to be a frightfully deterministic universe. And it troubles me to this extent, because it seems to me that on the one hand, the new atheists, of which Richard is a leader in the world, are trying in a way to hold on to the values that were given to them by Christianity, actually. And I would like to emphasize that, because in many of these books nothing good is said about religion. But Jürgen Habermas, who's not a Christian, of course, recently said that the foundations of our legal system and our education and our morality in Europe are based on Christianity. Everything else is postmodern chatter. What worries me is this, that can you really retain these good moral values and espouse atheism? Hard atheists like Nietzsche and Camus would say you can't. Eventually it will lead to madness. And some people are suggesting that that is actually what's going to happen. And I have a question for Richard Dawkins. Is his world the world of Peter Singer, where in the end moral values get so eroded by a naturalistic framework that Peter Singer can say a newborn baby is of no more value than a pig or a dog or a chimpanzee? Is that the world to which the new atheism is leading us?
Peter Singer is one of the most moral people I know, and when he says something like that, it is based upon a very rigorous moral philosophic reasoning. He's interested in suffering, and his point is there that a newborn baby, or certainly a human fetus, may be less capable of suffering than, say, a full-grown pig. That seems to me to be an entirely rational point of view, at least an entirely defensible point of view. However, it was tossed in at the last minute, and I don't want to take all my time dealing with that. John, you quoted me as saying the universe has at bottom no good, no evil, and you said it has exactly the properties we'd expect if there was nothing there. You said that sounds horribly deterministic. Well, another way of putting that would be to say that the universe is horribly rational, horribly intelligible. And one of the main points you've been making is precisely that we live in an intelligible universe. And that's one of the things that we need to explain, and you think it needs a God in order to explain it. What I would like to know is, what would an unintelligible universe look like? How could any creature live as we live? How could any creature have evolved and survived in a universe that didn't have that kind of mathematical intelligibility? It's the anthropic principle again. Just as we could only be living in a universe that has stars, because you need stars to make molecules, so we could only have survived in a universe where there is rationality. I cannot conceive of what an irrational, unlawful universe would look like. Now, science doesn't know everything. So it's one of the glories of science that we know what we don't know, and we work on what we don't know, try to shrink what we don't know. It's hard work. We don't cop out by saying, oh, well, if you come to a difficult problem, magic must have done it, or God must have done it. No, we don't say that. We say, right, that's a problem to be solved. It may not be solved this century, it may be solved in the following century, or the one after that. But we don't just lie down and give up and say, oh, well, it must be magic because we don't yet understand it. I would hold up Darwin as a model for the whole of science, because before Darwin came along, the whole of life, the complexity of life, the beauty of life, the elegance of life, the apparent design of life looked like magic. And everybody thought it was magic. Everybody thought that God did it. It's so complicated, it's so elegant. Now, that was the really big problem. That was a far bigger problem than the problem of the origin of life, than the problem of the origin of the cosmos. Darwin solved that problem. All scientists now know that. Darwin solved that problem, and in so doing, he provided us with a sort of parable that don't even think about giving up, because if ever there was a time to have given up, it was in the case of biology. Because biology really was a difficult problem, a hard problem. Darwin solved it. Now we have one or two other problems remaining, like the origin of life, like the origin of the cosmos, the origin of the laws of physics. No doubt that there are physicists here who can point to yet other ones. Darwin provides us with a lesson that says, don't give up, because if Darwin could solve it for the really difficult problem, which was life, then we have every hope that science will solve it for the other problems in the end. And even if it doesn't, even if science doesn't solve all problems ever, that is still no grounds for saying, oh, well, magic did it.